if we go to Tour of Inside Mathematics, you can have a chance to look at some of these conversations. This is where you've got a chance to really expand who counts as your colleagues. You might have, say, another three third grade teachers at your school. You might, depending on your schedule, have a chance to meet with those people once or twice a week, maybe more frequently. You might have opportunities that your administration has devoted to thinking about your mathematics teaching. But if not, and if you feel isolated, or if you are perhaps trying to get this going at your school, if you are the change agent, what you might do is you might click here with the classroom teachers and take a look at what these teachers whose work are represented here have to say about what they think others will, what they hope others will learn from the resources here, how they focus on their learners and serve diverse learning needs, how they build some of these norms for mathematical discourse, how they dig deep into these math problems, and how they respond to the unexpected, because even a really tested mathematics lesson never goes exactly like you think it's going to. You might have a lot of the ideas on this website build from the Japanese pedagogical model and curriculum model of lesson study. The idea of lesson study is that a group of teachers and educators will come together and build a really, really strong lesson together. They test it in all of their classrooms. They observe each other teaching this lesson. They refine it again and again to make it increasingly oriented toward the student learning outcomes. And so this builds from that thinking. But I think that even when you have a really tested lesson that you've anticipated, some of the student responses, it's never going to go exactly the way you expect, because teaching is relational. It's spontaneous. It exists in that space between teacher and students. And so I think that there's always going to be those moments of things not going exactly the way that you plan, or perhaps things taking more time than you think that they will, or going more quickly than you think that they will. So how do these teachers respond to those unexpected moments? And then also, what these teachers whose work is on Inside Mathematics have learned from seeing each other's classrooms. Sometimes, and I'll just speak for myself, teaching practice can be lonely. You can feel isolated. You can close that classroom door, and that's a literal and metaphorical division between you and the other practitioners at your classroom. One of the things that's most special about learning to teach is that you get a chance to apprentice in lots of different people's classrooms. And so once you have your own classroom, sometimes those opportunities reduce. And so even for these teachers who have very strong collaborative dynamics at their schools, that they still learned a great deal from being able to see each other's classrooms. They noticed things that they have in common. They learned strategies that they could swipe and apply into their own classrooms. This is how teachers grow and learn. And so I think that you'll see through clicking through any one of these. I'll take a chance and just look at Tour 1, for example. And so here's, and obviously in this video I'm not going to play another video, but if you click here you can see what are the hopes that these teachers have for the Inside Mathematics website. How do they think that they, their colleagues, countless anonymous others might use the resources that are here. This actually can then connect to some of the examples of classroom practice. You can see over here, this is students investigating a quote-unquote wrong answer, comparing and evaluating some of these strategies, or even reflecting after a lesson. So again, all of these different conversations among the classroom teachers will allow you to dig deeper into practitioner reflections around these teaching and learning strategies. Then you have this group of conversations among mathematics coaches. This is a different kind of educator's work. The math coaches whose work is represented here are all experienced classroom teachers as well, and accomplished mathematicians. And they've moved into these supervisory mentoring roles in their schools, in their districts, wherein they can visit people's classrooms and work in a kind of conversational tutorial kind of model to help teachers develop their mathematics teaching and build it into an even more strong series of practices. But again, coaches don't often get a chance to talk to each other about their work. So if you click here, for example, you can hear these three different mathematics coaches reflecting on that Japanese practice of lesson study. How do teachers learn from observing others teaching. And what do they help teachers attend to when they're watching other people teaching? I recall in working with some coaches that one coach talked about how she needs to remind teachers to look out and look in when they visit someone's classroom. So a lot of times when people visit people's classrooms, they're looking out. They're saying, oh, that's a great poster, or, ooh, that's an interesting example of student work over there on that bulletin board, or, oh, I like the way she's arranged her desks, or, oh, wasn't that an interesting smartboard lesson that he presented? But these coaches have talked about how they also need to call teachers to attend to the subtleties of practice. They need to look in. What exists in those spaces between teacher and students? How do they spontaneously provoke or capitalize on a teachable moment, quote unquote, to continually get kids to be in, as Vygotsky talks about it, that zone of proximal development. We want our teaching to challenge students without being inaccessible to them. We don't want it to be too easy. So if we imagine that students' learning capacity is right here, we want our teaching to be right here and to just be continually pulling them, stretching them just beyond where they're able to go all by themselves. So I think that the job of the math coach is very interesting because their role is to call teachers to re-examine their own teaching practices, their assumptions, their own misconceptions in some cases, perhaps the areas in which they need to build their own content learning, particularly in mathematics. And so I think that getting a chance to look at and listen to these mathematics coaches reflecting on lesson study in this case, or on how they what they see their role as being in teacher learning, or how they use these particular tasks in a school setting. I think that this is all really important, and I think that a lot of times these folks, their practice is invisible. There's not really, you wouldn't go necessarily and get a teaching license in being a math coach. This emerges from accomplished years of practice in the classroom as well as talking to colleagues. And so these coaches then have gotten to build a sense of how do you build not only that zone of proximal development for students, but for teachers as well. And how do you use these tasks to occasion that process in both of those constituencies? So if I go back to these video tours again, lastly, we have the perspective of some school principals, because again, that's a different scale of getting math education reform going. So we have two different principals who are talking here. We have Jagwanana Lathan, who is the principal of Anna Yates Elementary School, and Deb Negretti, who is the principal of Ida Price Middle School. And they have a particular perspective on how you get a group of teachers or a school-wide setting engaged in thinking about mathematics in a particular way. So Principal Lathan talks about how they have worked at her school to increase the focus on mathematics. We know that in this era of high-stakes tests or external ways of assessing student learning that have very, very high stakes for teachers, for students, for schools, for districts, that this is not a minor issue here. So the whole school has to think about what is our disposition towards mathematics teaching. Moreover, she talks about how to promote this professional learning community around mathematics. Sometimes, I'm not speaking about any of you necessarily, teachers will hide when they don't understand something fully and maybe gloss over it. Or maybe just stick with the textbook, and then if the kids' misconceptions don't fall within that domain, they perhaps don't have the skills to be able to push that and address it really in a really strong way. So, pardon me, if you have this professional learning community going in a school, you can start to have those walls fall down, and for it to be okay for teachers to say, you know, I need to understand the relationship of an array to iterative addition. Pardon me for that. But anyway, to get this professional learning community going in the school, we need teachers to be able to be okay with saying to each other, you know, here's something I've worked on a lot. I'm ready to receive feedback on this. Or here's an area that's coming up in my curriculum that I feel like I need to work on. Or here's a pattern in my students' work that I need to understand better so that I can reteach and really push on those misconceptions to get my students beyond that. This is all oriented around student learning, around teacher learning, around school-wide performance, and I think that getting the perspective of these school principals will help us think about how to get that going. Next, I'm going to move into this Tools for Educators area, where I'll give you a sense of what these kinds of resources are and how they apply to your classroom.